Today in this video, we're going to take some 2x4s and some of this old plywood and turn it into this.
So in our last two videos, we just mainly used a 2x4 to help build our bandsaw box, just one 2x4, and in our treasure chest, we just had basically 3/8 plywood. We're both cheapskates, and we decided, hey, let's combine the two pieces of wood together and make an end table with a secret compartment, because that's what we do. So we're going to start with the box portion. Let's get to it. So originally we were going to plane down our back 2x4 where our lock was going to sit, but our planer happens to be down. So what we're going to try and do is use our table saw to try and cut the width of the board down, because sometimes the magnet can't reach through. So that's what we're going to try. Getting the cuts to match up perfectly on both sides of the 2x4 was a little bit tricky, but after some trial and error we managed to get the job done. And any imperfections that were left over, we just cleaned up on the joining.
Okay, we finished cutting our wood for our sides, and now we need to place in some countersink holes for our screws, and we'll start attaching it to our legs.
Okay. When you're working with pine, it's really important to create good pilot holes. Neglecting to do so can end up splitting your board where you're trying to screw, and speaking from experience, we've had this happen a lot. Alright, now that we got our framework up for our nightstand, we're just building the framework for our bottom shelf. These things are going to go... Stop it. We're going to put these things in between here as some bracing, and the shelf will just sit right on top of that. So that's what we're doing. For our top and bottom shelf, we went with the same 3/8 plywood that we used in our treasure chest video. Not because it was our first choice, but because it was donated to us by a friend. We have several pallets of this stuff lying around our shop, and we want to make sure to use it all up. So in future videos, you'll probably see plenty of this stuff being used. If you don't have a bandsaw, you can use a jigsaw to cut out the corners of your bottom piece. Jigsaws are usually cheaper and are great for if you're just getting into woodworking.
Okay, now that we cut the bottom part out of our table, we're going to put some cleats in where this part will rest on that. Okay, and that's all we're going to do.
Oh, must be mini. How tiny are those?
Oh no.
I was just asking, how tiny are those nails?
I got.
So now that we got our framework and our bottom shelf done, the next step is to just cut the two pieces that are going to be for our tabletop. They're just going to be out of that 3/8 plywood, and then we're going to square them up and glue them together. Whenever you're making a tabletop of any kind, it's important to make sure that the whole thing looks square. So So because we stacked two pieces on top of each other, we went around the edges with a ruler to make sure all the sides were nice and even. After that, we just added a ton of glue and shot some nails in for some extra support. Another thing we noticed with the top piece was that the middle was kind of bowing up. So in order to remedy this, we just clamped it to the frame overnight.
We're ready to attach our slides to the tops, okay? And we've never done this before, so it's going to take a little time to make sure that we line up these slides and this slide on here so that the top is centered right.
When using this setup, it's really important to make sure that your lock is working against your glides. If you have the lock and the glides facing the same direction, your lid won't be able to close, leaving you with a really awkward piece of furniture. So now that we got our glides on, we realized that we need a way to help conceal this gap here that's going to exist between the tabletop and the frame. The way we're going to hide that is by attaching trim pieces on the front and back to kind of hide that gap. In the front, we're actually going to attach that trim piece to the tabletop. That way it can move along and act as a stop, because these are actually designed for drawers, and the back of the drawer usually stops these glides, but they don't have a stop. So we're going to have to make one so that they actually do stop. As you can probably tell, we really love using 2x4s in our projects. All we used for our trim were some leftover pieces from our frame that we didn't end up using.
Okay, before we put the trim on, we have to get this locking mechanism in place. If we're off with it, it'll rattle, it'll move around. So I made some measurements, and we got to pull the top off, and we'll put it in place.
As Dad just alluded to, it's really important to make sure there's very little slack between your plastic stop and your lock. If there's too much slack, the entire tabletop will shake, completely giving away your hiding spot for the TV remote. Looking back at these carvings, I realized that the entire tabletop itself is actually quite barren, but because we were pressed for time, I wasn't able to add the amount of detail that I would have liked to. Hopefully on future projects, I'll be able to put more time and effort into the carvings, because that's really the part that I enjoy the most. Overall, we were both really happy with the way this one turned out. The locking mechanism was a little finicky sometimes, and getting the trim to fit right was, again, just a little bit tricky. But once we kind of worked all the kinks out and sanded some spots, it definitely worked good. So again, thanks for watching, guys. Comment down below if you want to see us build a different project or something weird or out of the blue or something that you just find on the internet. And thanks for watching. Thanks.
Bye.